Hello, and thank you for tuning into Answers from the Lab, where we share Mayo Clinic knowledge and advancements on the state of testing and science from laboratory leaders and the people who are making it happen behind the scenes. I'm Dr. Bobbi Pritt, the chair of the Division of Clinical Microbiology in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. With me today is Dr. Bill Morice, the chair of the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic and the president of Mayo Clinic Laboratories. This is our weekly discussion with Dr. Morice, in which we learn about updates in the field of laboratory medicine and pathology. Bill, welcome back.
Another week, another podcast.
And another virus to talk about, many different viruses, I guess, right? We've been hearing about all these different viruses.
Yes, there's a lot. I don't know. I'm sure people are interested, and it's because I know they are, because it's come up. You know, are there really all these new viruses, or is this just something we're hearing more about because of COVID? And so I think there's a lot of questions out there about all these different things we're hearing about.
Well, that's a really good point, because as a microbiologist, I could tell you that some of these are new variants of existing viruses, for example, SARS-CoV-2, but there have certainly been coronaviruses around for, millennia, evolving alongside of us as humans. So that's not new. And then, of course, we've been hearing about adenovirus. That's not new. And then monkeypox. That's been going on the African continent, and we've had occasional cases over the years. So it's just interesting that we're hearing about all of these cases now. Some thoughts from the community have been, perhaps we've kind of decreased some of our immunity over the past couple of years with coronavirus. And so now we're getting, more outbreaks, and they're coming up in atypical fashion than we would normally expect.
Yeah, I think like monkeypox is a good example of that, as I understand it, because that's, right, again, something that's been around for centuries, actually, from what we can tell. And you can correct me, you're the microbiologist, I'm the hematopathologist. But the other thing that's really interesting about that too is that it also has an animal reservoir, which actually isn't even monkeys. It's actually
right, it's rodents. Yeah.
So yeah, you're right. But they're just catching people's attention because we haven't had very many outbreaks, and this one does seem a little bit peculiar, I guess, and compared to others. I don't know, but you know more about that than I do.
Well, thankfully, we've had some experts just recently talking about these. So we had Dr. Matt Vinegar, who's our head of clinical virology, and Dr. Vinegar talked about both the unexplained cases of hepatitis in children, which may be associated with a strain of adenovirus. And then he also talked about monkeypox virus. And then recently, we've also had Dr. Ellie Thiel, our director of the infectious disease serology lab, talking about Powassan virus, which is a tick-borne virus. And then, of course, you and I have been talking about coronavirus for, years now, right?
Yeah, yes, true enough. It has been years. And I think that it's kind of interesting to me. Monkeypox caught a lot of media attention, I think, because of the name. But actually, this viral infection, apparent viral hepatitis in children, thankfully rare, but actually quite serious, I think. So can be even some fatalities or need for liver transplant have been reported. So I think it speaks to the need for continued vigilance in identifying these different pathogens that can infect humans and cause real problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as the microbiologist, as you mentioned, I can give our audience some general fun facts about viruses, although probably most people now have a pretty good idea of what a virus is. But it's interesting, there's some debate as to whether or not they're actually alive, because they can carry genetic material and they can replicate that genetic material, but they lack cell structures. So they're kind of right on the edge of life. They're really not quite alive. And of course, we can't see them with our naked eye or even a routine light microscope. And they can infect every single other type of life form on the planet, including bacteria. So kind of fascinating, also kind of scary. And I'll give you one other fun fact. There are only 2 organisms that we have eradicated through human activity purposefully, and that is smallpox virus and rinderpest virus. So the 2 organisms we've been able to eradicate by the use of vaccines have both been viruses. One's a human pathogen and one's a cattle pathogen.
Interesting. Yeah. It's fascinating. It's funny that you mentioned that, because I remember for those of us that have been in the public domain through the pandemic, that was really challenging early on about where you could catch COVID from. and was it alive on surfaces? And it's like, well, it's not a very straightforward question to answer because of what you said, but to try and explain that on the fly could be pretty difficult. So I think, though, overall, there is an awareness now around viruses, clearly, that there was not in the past, mostly because we've had some near misses with these, like the first SARS outbreak, or MERS, or even the Zika virus was more limited in terms of it didn't affect everybody, and Ebola was one that we worried about. So they're out there, and I think that, and more importantly too, is that we're probably gonna have to keep dealing with this. And I know, for instance, you brought up the Possum virus. There's others, I think, that are in your division. We're working on bringing the tests up even as we speak, right? Or looking into that.
Yeah, on my list for development is Heartland virus. That's another virus transmitted by ticks. Bourbon virus would be lower down, but also something to consider. Then we have Jamestown Canyon virus, which is spread by mosquitoes. And as you know, I'm interested in things transmitted by vectors, ticks, mosquitoes, sandflies. And then, of course, there's a whole host of other viruses out there. You've mentioned some like Ebola. To me, this really brings three things to mind. First of all, we are indeed a global society. You and I have been saying this all along. You can circumnavigate the globe in 24 to 36 hours at the equator. So you can bring Ebola or monkeypox quickly to many other parts of the country. So then the second point would be, obviously, we need to identify those cases to prevent the spread. You brought up those near misses, like the first SARS was very quickly contained by the public health system, and that was essential. So it came up into Canada, but it never came down into the United States. If it had, we could have had a whole outbreak like what we're experiencing now. And that brings me to my third point, which is the importance of testing, because without the laboratory being able to detect these new pathogens, figuring out what they are, that leads to vaccines, that leads to treatment, and it leads to all of our public health measures and understanding how they spread. So it all comes back to the lab, right?
Yeah, it does indeed. And actually, this is another, I know we've talked about things that are in interest at the federal government level, but this is obviously another topic, is the whole concept of pandemic preparedness, because all of these viruses, the ones that you describe, are ones that make their way into human. They exist, and many of them we have no inkling. They're living out in animal reservoirs, but once they cross into humans, if they have the ability to spread by human-to-human transmission, you have the potential for an outbreak. And that, in the past in the U.S., it's really been within the purview of the CDC and the public health laboratories to create the test to respond to this. But with COVID, go back a couple of years ago now, clearly, and even over the last 2 years ago, the summer when we were really struggling, we couldn't keep up with demand. There's going to be, I think, there is an very active piece of legislation being worked on in terms of pandemic preparedness, probably more than one, but there's one I'm aware of. And a big part of that is really conversations now about what does that look like from a testing perspective? How can we what happened with COVID was we had public-private partnerships, which really had to rise to the occasion. And what can we learn from that? I know there were probably a lot of people listening to podcasts that were working in labs that were really frustrated because it felt like a COVID test should be something that could have developed. And, we really need to, and we didn't harness all the laboratory infrastructure that we had in the country as quickly as we would have wanted. This is the kind of thinking, because all of these pathogens have the ability to appear on the scene and create the need for a test that weeks before did not exist.
Yeah, when you're dealing with something brand new, clearly you need people to very quickly analyze what it is, figure it out. We were lucky early on that we had scientists that shared the genetic code, the sequence data for SARS-CoV-2 so that people could start developing tests. And then it really did lead to that public-private partnership to develop testing. But I agree that there's still opportunities. I think it could have happened faster. Usually our public health labs are the first ones to get actual virus and material. And so looking at ways that could then be turned into control material so other people could develop tests would be important. So I think this pandemic preparedness legislation is going to be quite important and has some really good potentials. especially because we now know that there are going to be other outbreaks in the future. We've been seeing that. It looks like about every 3 to 5 years, we see something crop up, and it might be small, it might go away on its own, but it's going to continue to challenge us and keep us in business, I suppose.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that's, a lot of the good news is that a lot of the capabilities exist, right? As you mentioned, the public health having access to the material and all early on. We now need a flexible rules really that allows these things to be shared, because right now the public health labs and CDC are very reticent to share materials, and it has to do with kind of the rules about how that happens. And so we need to be more forward looking in some of the policies that we have in place and procedures to help us all respond more quickly. And that's the good news. And the challenging news, as you said, is we've already described it. I've been now in my 8th year as chair. We've had 3 different viral outbreaks, COVID being the most dramatic that I've had to think about how we're going to respond. And what is clear is that as the earth changes, as there's more people on it, there's more and more contact between humans and animals that we haven't been around before. So that's where a lot of these reservoir for viruses are, as you said. So we have to be ready, because it has been a 3 to 5 year cycle. I think there's a sense right now, well, when people talk about this, is it just being alarmist and taking advantage of the pandemic? And it's no, unfortunately, this is something we've been dealing with as a species for, eons really, but also something that we are probably going to see happening more frequently between more people and more travel, as you said.
I agree. And in my world with vectors, mosquitoes and ticks, they're changing their distribution too. As the climate changes, they're moving into places that they haven't been before. And then that puts more people at risk. So it's definitely multifactorial as to why we are seeing more novel pathogens or outbreaks of known pathogens now than we did before.
Yeah, that's a great point too. I mean, just as for instance, I know that I think was it encephalitis, there was something in the Southwest because it was so rainy over the winter that they had more mosquitoes and more transmission of mosquito-borne illnesses. So yeah, it's a changing world, and the labs are going to have to be able to keep up.
Absolutely. Well, I think that we have a strong foundation to build on, and we have some new legislation that hopefully will help. And we'll just keep working on this and presenting what we know to the rest of the lab community through this podcast.
That's right. And hopefully for all of us to continue to work together, because we are. I mean, that's one thing, we can't let the memory fade of how important the labs are in terms of protecting the public health.
Absolutely. Well, always great talking to you, Bill. Thanks again for joining me.
Yeah, no, it's always my pleasure. So I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Answers from the Lab. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast, and don't forget to tune in every Thursday and every other Tuesday.